The Spencerville mill, built in the early 1860s by Robert Fairbairn, was gutted by fire 20 years later. It was soon rebuilt within the remaining stone walls and ready once again to mill farmers' grain into flour and feed. Step back in time at the Spencerville mill, where 100 years ago, local farmers could bring their grain to be milled into flour and livestock feed.
The first order of business in the milling process was to weigh the farmer's wheat on the scales located in the main level. The farmers paid the miller by giving him a portion of his grain. For example, if the farmer brought in 1,000 pounds, or about 10 bags of grain, he would take home 880 pounds, or about 9 bags of milled product. The miller kept 120 pounds of the farmer's grain as payment. After weighing, the wheat was dumped down a chute found on the floor, into a bin on the lower level, where it was then sent on its journey to be changed from wheat into flour or poultry and livestock feed by the mill's machinery. All the machinery in the mill was powered by water. During the dry season, when the water in the South Nation River was low, steam power and later gasoline engines kept the mill operating year-round. In the 1930s, the water wheel was replaced with a more efficient and powerful water turbine. A raceway carried the water under the mill and through the turbine. A wheel on the main level allowed the miller to open fins on the turbine. The water rushing through the raceway caught the fins on the turbine and caused it to spin. Mounted on the turbine was a crown gear. It drove the pinion gear, which was fastened to the main shaft. Over time, the wooden teeth on the crown gears were worn down by the steel gear of the pinion and would have to be replaced about every 10 years. From the main shaft, strong cotton belts attached to the equipment in the mill. By maintaining proper tension, the belts powered all the mill's machinery. Let's review. Water caused the turbine to spin. The crown gear would drive the pinion gear found on the main shaft. This caused the main shaft, with its cotton belts, to spin, thus powering all the mill's machinery. Although not functional, much of the machinery and power system can still be seen in the mill today. Earlier, we saw the farmer's wheat being dumped into the lower level, where it was then picked up by an elevator and moved to the third or upper level of the mill. The elevator was an endless belt fitted with metal buckets which carried the wheat through wooden shafts. The wheat was then gravity fed down to a hopper on the main level and into the large flour roller to be ground. The ground wheat came out of the machine and dropped through wooden chutes into the lower level. Another elevator carried the ground wheat back to the upper level, where it was then processed through a bolter to sift and grade the wheat into 5 products from the finest to the coarsest. These 5 products dropped through chutes to the main level. The first and finest product was sifted through silk cloth. It was first patent flour used for the best home baking. The next 3 products were sifted through wire screening. Second patent flour came next. It was a coarser grade and was used for bread making and by bakeries. Third was a low-grade flour, later called middlings. This was used mainly for livestock feed. Shorts was the softer part of the kernel of wheat and was used in livestock feed. What was left was the outer brown husk called bran. It was also mixed into livestock feed. Flour was bagged into cotton sacks and livestock feed was put into burlap bags, which would then be sewn shut by hand. As well as wheat, farmers brought other types of grain to the mill: barley and oats, buckwheat, and corn were made into poultry and livestock feed. Some of these grains were also made into flour and meal used in home baking. Oats were rolled to make rolled oats. Buckwheat was ground into flour, and corn was made into cornmeal. As with wheat, the other grains were first weighed and then dumped through bins into the elevator in the lower level to be carried up to the third level. Buckwheat and corn could be processed through the large flour roller, oats through the small flour roller, and all livestock or poultry feed might be put through the grinder. From the machines, the processed grain fell down chutes into the lower level to be carried back up to the third level, where it was then directed into chutes for bagging on the main level. Wheat or buckwheat was processed through the bolter, which vibrated and caused the grain to sift through increasingly larger holes, sorting out what would be used for home baking. From buckwheat came buckwheat flour, and from corn came cornmeal. The coarser parts of these grains went back into the poultry and livestock feed. When all the machinery was operating, the mill was a noisy, bustling center of agricultural industry.
The machinery installed when the mill was rebuilt after the fire in 1884 made it one of the most up-to-date flour mills of its era. But times were changing, and within a few short years, housewives wanted brand-named, super-refined white flour. As the demand for locally milled flour decreased, many small country mills closed. The Spencerville mill, however, continued to flourish for several decades with the development of balanced poultry and livestock feeds introduced by J.F. Barnard and Sons under the trade name Grow or Bust. Explore the lower and main levels of the Spencerville mill, now being restored to the early 1900s. This massive stone and timber structure, its machinery, artifacts, and displays recall an era when the village of Spencerville was described by the Canadian Illustrated News as having tradesmen's shops able to supply every community need, several well-stocked general stores, and a flour and grist mill producing as fine a brand of flours as any country mill in Canada.